The iron gates opened with a mechanical whisper that sounded like a warning, and Eleanor guided her ancient Honda up the winding driveway, her breath catching as the Thornhill estate came into view through sheets of late autumn rain. The mansion rose before her like something out of a film, all pale stone and towering windows that reflected the gray sky in cold, perfect symmetry. Her lower back throbbed with the dull ache that had become her constant companion these past weeks, and the baby pressed heavily against her bladder, a reminder that she was 8 months along and had no business taking this job. But the overtime pay was 3 times her usual rate, and her savings account had exactly $427 standing between her and complete disaster. She parked near the service entrance as instructed, heaving herself out of the driver's seat with an ungraceful grunt, her cleaning supply caddy heavy in one hand while the other pressed against her spine. Inside, the silence was absolute and unsettling, the kind of quiet that existed only in places where people paid extraordinary amounts of money to keep the world at bay. The grand foyer stretched before her, all gleaming marble floors and a staircase that curved upward like a sculpture, and everything was so pristine it looked as though no one actually lived here, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Eleanor set down her supplies and lowered herself carefully to her knees, the position sending an immediate protest through her hips. But she had learned to ignore discomfort, had become an expert at pushing through pain because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant drowning. She started scrubbing, her movements rhythmic and practiced, watching the already clean marble somehow become more luminous under her cloth. The contraction started as a tightening across her belly, not painful exactly but insistent, and she paused, breathing through it, recognizing it as another round of Braxton Hicks, her body's dress rehearsal for the main event she was desperately trying not to think about. The contraction faded and she continued working, focused on the repetitive motion, the way the light caught in the stone, anything but the fear that lived just beneath her ribs. She did not hear him approach, did not sense another presence, until his voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Why did they send you?" Not a question but an accusation, low and controlled and vibrating with something she could not name. Eleanor looked up, and her heart kicked hard against her sternum. The man standing 10 feet away was tall and dark-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her car, and his face was all sharp angles and cold assessment, his eyes so dark they were nearly black as they traveled over her with an expression she could not read. She struggled to get to her feet, clumsy and off balance, her hand bracing against the floor. "I am from the agency," she managed, hating how breathless she sounded. "I am here for the deep clean." His jaw tightened visibly, and he moved closer, each step deliberate. And Eleanor felt her pulse spike with an instinctive wariness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, acute awareness of how he filled the space, how his presence seemed to charge the air. "You are 8 months pregnant," he said flatly. "You should not be on your hands and knees scrubbing floors." Eleanor lifted her chin, exhaustion and desperation sharpening into defiance. "I can do the work," she said. "I need this job." He stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his features. And then he pulled out his phone, turning slightly away, but keeping his eyes on her as though she might collapse if he looked away. His voice dropped to a tone that was quiet, but carried absolute authority as he spoke into the phone, words she could not quite make out. And Eleanor felt a cold knot of dread forming in her stomach because she knew that tone, knew it meant decisions being made about her without her input. And she had heard it before from doctors and social workers and the father of her baby when he told her what she should do. The man ended the call and looked at her again, his expression still unreadable, but his eyes holding something that might have been anger or might have been concern, and Eleanor could not breathe properly, could not think past the crushing certainty that she was about to lose this job and the money she so desperately needed, and worse, she was intensely, inappropriately aware of the way he was looking at her, as though she were a problem he intended to solve whether she wanted him to or not. You are terminated from the cleaning service effective immediately." The words landed like blows, and Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her, panic flooding hot and sharp through her chest. "No," she started, but he cut her off with a raised hand, his expression unchanged. "Sit down before you hurt yourself or the baby." It was not a request. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to salvage this, but another contraction was starting, tightening like a band around her middle, and her legs were shaking badly enough that she let him guide her to a bench along the wall, his hand firm on her elbow. He disappeared and returned moments later with a glass of water, pressing it into her hands with an intensity that felt at odds with the clinical distance in his voice. "Drink." She obeyed, because she was too stunned to do otherwise, her mind racing through calculations of how quickly her savings would evaporate, how many shifts she would need to pick up, whether Mrs. Chen at the diner would let her work doubles, even though she was already cutting Eleanor's hours out of concern. The man stood over her, arms crossed, watching her with that same unreadable expression, and then he spoke again, his tone sharp. "Where is the father?" Eleanor flinched. "Gone." "Does he provide support?" "No." She took another sip of water to avoid his gaze. "Do you have family?" The question was relentless, precise, as though he were conducting an investigation rather than a conversation. Eleanor shook her head, her throat tight. "My parents died 4 years ago. Car accident. I have no siblings." His jaw tightened and something flickered across his face that might have been anger, though she could not tell if it was directed at her or her circumstances. "How are you surviving?" The bluntness should have offended her, but instead it cracked something open inside her chest. "I work 3 jobs," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "I have been saving. I have a plan." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, devoid of humor. "A plan that involves scrubbing floors at 8 months pregnant." Eleanor's exhaustion crystallized into anger, and she looked up at him, meeting those dark eyes directly. "I do what I have to do. I do not need your judgment." For a long moment he stared at her, and she refused to look away, refused to let him see how terrified she was, how close to breaking. Then he moved, crouching down so they were at eye level, and the sudden proximity stole her breath. "I am going to make you an offer," he said quietly, and his voice had shifted into something she could not quite identify, something that felt almost dangerous in its intensity. "You will move into this house. You will stop working. You will let me provide for you and the baby until after the birth." Eleanor laughed, a sharp, desperate sound. "You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious." "Why would you possibly do that?" She searched his face for the catch, for the hidden agenda, because men did not offer things like this without expecting something in return, and she had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. He stood, putting distance between them again, and when he spoke his voice was cold, controlled. "Because I have 14 bedrooms sitting empty, and you are one missed shift away from collapsing. Because I do not want your suffering on my conscience." Eleanor pushed herself to her feet, her hands trembling with adrenaline and fury. "I do not need your charity. You do not have a choice," he said flatly. "You will accept my offer because the alternative is you and your baby ending up in a crisis worse than you can imagine, and I will not allow that to happen." The arrogance of it, the absolute certainty, made her want to scream. "You do not get to decide what I do." His eyes locked on hers, and she saw something flicker there, something fierce and immovable. "You are right. But you are going to choose this anyway, because despite what you think of me right now, you are smart enough to know when you are out of options." Eleanor left the mansion with fury singing hot through her veins, her hands shaking as she drove away from the estate and its arrogant owner who thought he could decide her life with his money and his cold certainty. And for the next 3 days, she pushed herself harder than she ever had, determined to prove that she did not need Alexander Thornhill or his charity, that she was capable of taking care of herself and her baby, without his interference. She picked up extra shifts at the all-night diner where she had been working weekends, the fluorescent lights harsh and flickering as she moved between tables with a pot of coffee that felt heavier each hour, her feet swelling in her cheap sneakers until every step was a small agony. The overnight hours bled into early morning office cleaning jobs downtown, buildings full of empty cubicles and the chemical smell of industrial cleaner, and she would scrub conference room tables and vacuum endless stretches of gray carpet while her back screamed and the baby pressed against her ribs as though trying to escape the exhaustion that saturated her bones. On the third night, sometime around 2 in the morning, when the diner was nearly empty, except for a drunk couple in the corner booth and a truck driver nursing his fourth cup of coffee, Eleanor felt the room tilt sideways without warning, the coffee pot slipping from her grip and shattering across the floor in a spray of glass and hot liquid. Mrs. Chen was there instantly, her small, weathered hands gripping Eleanor's arms, guiding her into a chair in the back while she spoke in rapid Mandarin that Eleanor did not understand, but whose tone of worry was unmistakable. "You cannot do this anymore," Mrs. Chen said in English, her accent thick, but her meaning crystal clear, as she pressed a glass of water into Eleanor's hands. "You are going to hurt yourself and the baby, and I will not let that happen in my restaurant." Eleanor started to protest, but the words dissolved into tears. She had been holding back for days, maybe weeks, maybe since the moment Marcus walked out and left her alone with a positive pregnancy test and a future that looked like nothing but struggle. Mrs. Chen sat beside her and waited, patient and kind, until Eleanor could breathe again, until she could admit that she had nowhere to go, no family to fall back on, no safety net between her and complete disaster. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, and then said something that made Eleanor's heart stop. "That rich man who came here yesterday looking for you, he seemed very worried, very serious about finding you." Eleanor stared at her, shock cutting through the exhaustion. "What man?" "The one in the expensive suit," Mrs. Chen said, "like he owned the whole city, asking if I knew Eleanor Whitmore, saying it was urgent that he speak with you." When Eleanor finally made it back to her apartment as dawn was breaking gray and cold through her single window, she found the envelope immediately, a heavy cream-colored rectangle that had been slipped under her door, and inside was a cashier's check for $1,000 made out to her name and a small card with a phone number printed in stark black ink. Nothing else, no message or explanation. Eleanor sat on her second-hand couch that sagged in the middle and stared at the check until the numbers blurred, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her belly where the baby was kicking. Strong, insistent movements that felt like questions she did not know how to answer, and she understood with a clarity that felt like defeat and relief in equal measure that her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Eleanor called the number at 2 in the morning because sleep was impossible, her mind circling endlessly around the check and the phone number and the impossible choice between her pride and her baby's future. And when she finally pressed the last digit, her hand was shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. But before she could lose her nerve, the line clicked open and his voice came through, low and alert, answering on the first ring as though he had been sitting beside the phone waiting for this exact moment. "Hello, Eleanor." The fact that he knew it was her without asking sent a shiver down her spine that she told herself was unease, but felt dangerously close to something else. She opened her mouth to speak, but found her throat tight, and the silence stretched between them for several heartbeats before she managed to say, "I got your envelope," and the words came out smaller than she intended. He exhaled, a sound that might have been relief. "Good. Will you accept my offer?" Eleanor closed her eyes and pressed her free hand against her belly, where the baby was awake and restless, moving beneath her palm like a question waiting for an answer. "I need to understand what you expect from me," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "There has to be something you want." "I told you what I want," he replied, and there was no impatience in his tone, only a careful precision. I want you and the baby safe and healthy. That is all." Eleanor laughed, the sound bitter and exhausted. No one does something like this for nothing. People do not just hand over money and housing to strangers out of kindness. What do you really want from me? The pause that followed felt weighted, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something quieter, almost vulnerable in a way that made her chest tighten. I have 14 empty bedrooms in a house that feels like a mausoleum. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. And you are working yourself into the ground while 8 months pregnant because you have no other options. The math is simple, Eleanor. I have resources sitting unused while you are suffering unnecessarily. She wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, and the baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if adding its own opinion to the conversation. You would have your own suite, he continued, his tone becoming more businesslike, as though sensing her resistance weakening. Complete autonomy over your space and your schedule. No obligations beyond taking care of yourself and attending medical appointments. You would have access to the kitchen, the grounds, anything you need. And after the baby is born, you would have 6 months to recover and decide what comes next. It sounded too good, too easy, and Eleanor's survival instincts screamed that there had to be a trap hidden somewhere in the generous offer. "What do you get out of this?" she asked, and hated how desperate she sounded. Another pause, longer this time, and when Alexander spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost missed it. Peace of mind. The knowledge that I did not stand by and let something terrible happen when I had the power to prevent it. Something in those words, in the raw edge beneath his controlled tone, cut through her defenses and made her believe him, made her think that maybe this was not about her at all, but about something in his past, some wound he was trying to heal by helping her. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "I will come to the estate tomorrow," she said finally. "We can discuss terms." She heard him exhale again, definite relief this time. "Tomorrow, then. 10 in the morning. And Eleanor, get some sleep." He ended the call before she could respond, and she sat in the darkness of her tiny apartment staring at the phone in her hand, her heart racing with a combination of terror and something that felt dangerously like hope. Her hands were trembling as she set the phone down, and she could not tell if it was from relief at having a lifeline or fear of what she was stepping into, what it might mean to accept help from a man like Alexander Thornhill, who seemed to see straight through her defenses to the desperation underneath. And as she finally lay down and closed her eyes, she could still hear his voice in her head, that carefully controlled tone that had cracked just enough to let her glimpse something wounded beneath. Miles away in his study, Alexander sat in the leather chair behind his desk and opened the locked drawer he never let anyone else access, pulling out the silver-framed photograph he kept hidden there, and he looked at Catherine's face, at her bright smile, and the visible curve of her belly in the photo taken 2 months before she died, and he whispered, "I am sorry, but I cannot watch another woman destroy herself when I have the means to help." And he knew she would understand even as guilt twisted in his chest for the way his thoughts kept circling back to Eleanor's exhausted eyes and her fierce, stubborn pride that reminded him so much of the woman he had lost. Eleanor arrived at the estate at exactly 10 in the morning, her stomach tight with nerves that had nothing to do with the baby pressing against her ribs, and she found Alexander waiting in his study with a man in an expensive charcoal suit who introduced himself as Richard Moss, attorney at law, and the formality of it all made the situation feel suddenly real in a way that terrified and steadied her in equal measure. Alexander gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his massive desk, and she lowered herself carefully, aware of how out of place she looked in her worn jeans and clearance rack sweater in this room of dark wood and old money. Mr. Moss opened a leather portfolio and explained that Mr. Thornhill had asked him to draft an agreement to ensure both parties had clear expectations and legal protections, and as he walked through the terms, Eleanor felt increasingly lightheaded at the sheer generosity being offered. She would live on the property rent-free with her own private suite, full access to all household resources including the kitchen and grounds and library, a monthly stipend of $2,000 for personal expenses, and complete medical coverage through her pregnancy and for 6 months postpartum, including all hospital costs and any specialists required. In exchange, the agreement stipulated only that she follow all medical advice, attend every prenatal appointment, allow Dr. Lydia Hastings to serve as her primary obstetrician, and notify Alexander immediately if she experienced any concerning symptoms. Eleanor read through the contract twice, searching for the hidden trap, the clause that would reveal what he really wanted. But there was nothing. No requirement that she work for him or provide any service. No restrictions on her freedom to leave, nothing that suggested this was anything other than exactly what he claimed it to be. She looked up at Alexander, who was watching her with that unreadable expression she was beginning to recognize as his default mask. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "What do you really get from this arrangement?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Mr. Moss glanced between them as though sensing he was witnessing something private. Then Alexander leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk, and said something that cracked his careful control. "My wife died in childbirth 5 years ago. She had complications, preeclampsia, that she hid from me because she did not want to seem weak, because she thought she could handle it alone. By the time I realized how sick she was, it was too late. They did an emergency cesarean, but we lost her and our daughter both." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs, and she saw the raw grief in his eyes, the guilt that had carved lines into his face. "I cannot save them," Alexander continued, his voice rough. "But I can make sure another woman does not destroy herself trying to be strong when she does not have to be. I can make sure another child has a chance. This is not charity, Eleanor. This is me trying to live with myself." The room was silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantel, and Eleanor understood with sudden clarity that this was not really about her at all, that she was a proxy for the woman he could not save, that his offer was an act of penance and desperate hope for redemption. She should have felt used or diminished by that realization, but instead she felt a strange kinship with this man, who was also drowning, who was also trying to survive the wreckage of circumstances beyond his control. She picked up the pen Mr. Moss offered and signed the agreement, her hand steady, and when she looked up, Alexander's expression had shifted into something that might have been relief or gratitude. After Mr. Moss left, Alexander led her upstairs to show her the suite that would be hers. And when he opened the door, Eleanor stepped into a space so beautiful it made her chest ache, all soft grays and warm creams, with enormous windows overlooking gardens that stretched toward distant trees, and she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, that she might actually be safe here. Eleanor settled into the mansion over the following week and found herself in a state of constant disorientation, moving through rooms so beautiful they felt unreal, like she had stepped into someone else's life and was merely playing a role that did not quite fit, and she kept expecting someone to appear and tell her there had been a mistake, that she did not belong in a place where the towels were softer than any blanket she had ever owned, and the shower in her suite had water pressure that felt like a luxury spa. Alexander was rarely home during those first days, leaving before she woke and returning long after she had retreated to her room. But she felt his presence everywhere in the meticulous arrangements that appeared as if by magic. The kitchen stocked with fresh fruits and vegetables and the specific brand of ginger tea that helped with her nausea, prenatal vitamins appearing on her bathroom counter without comment, appointments scheduled with Dr. Lydia Hastings, who turned out to be one of the top obstetricians in the city. When Eleanor met Dr. Hastings for her first examination, the woman was warm but direct, asking questions about Eleanor's medical history and previous prenatal care with a thoroughness that made Eleanor realize how inadequate her prior checkups had been, And after the exam, Dr. Hastings sat down with a serious expression and explained that Eleanor was suffering from stress-related complications and mild anemia, that she had been running on empty for so long her body was struggling to support the pregnancy. And she prescribed rest and proper nutrition with a firmness that left no room for argument. That evening, Alexander joined Eleanor for dinner for the first time, and she walked into the formal dining room to find the long mahogany table set with places at opposite ends, a distance of at least 15 feet between them, and the absurdity of it struck her so forcefully that she laughed before she could stop herself. Alexander looked up from where he stood near his chair, his expression carefully neutral, and asked what was funny. Eleanor gestured at the ridiculous setup and said, "If we are going to do this, we should at least be able to hear each other without shouting. And besides, the formality is absurd, given that you have seen me at my absolute worst, and I am living in your house." For a moment, Alexander just stared at her, and Eleanor wondered if she had overstepped. But then something shifted in his face, the severe lines softening almost imperceptibly, and he said the breakfast room then, and led her to a smaller space off the kitchen where a round table sat beneath windows overlooking the gardens. The meal that followed was stilted at first, both of them feeling their way through unfamiliar territory. But gradually the conversation began to flow as Eleanor asked about his work and Alexander described a development project downtown, and then somehow they were talking about her pregnancy cravings, which currently involved pickles and vanilla ice cream, and he admitted he preferred silence to music, which Eleanor found fascinating and slightly sad. She confessed her fear that she would be a terrible mother because she had no idea what she was doing, and Alexander was quiet for a long moment before saying, "The house feels less empty with you in it," and the simple honesty of those words made Eleanor's chest tighten with an emotion she was not ready to name. Eleanor began to establish a routine in the weeks that followed, finding a rhythm in the sprawling estate that somehow made the enormous space feel less intimidating, and she discovered that the library had become her sanctuary. A two-story room with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes and modern hardcovers alike, and she would spend her mornings curled in a wing-back chair near the windows with a book in her lap, though often she found herself staring out at the gardens instead, watching the way sunlight moved across the perfectly manicured lawns. The afternoons she spent walking those same gardens, moving slowly along gravel paths that wound between rose bushes and ornamental trees, her hand resting on her belly as the baby shifted and kicked, and it was during one of these walks that she felt the prickling awareness of being watched and looked up to see Alexander standing at his study window on the second floor, his figure dark against the glass, and something fluttered in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby and everything to do with the intensity of his gaze, even from that distance. Their dinner conversations had become a nightly ritual, something Eleanor found herself anticipating throughout the day, and gradually the exchanges grew more personal as layers of formality peeled away to reveal the people underneath. One evening, Alexander asked about her past, and Eleanor found herself telling him about her dreams of being a teacher, how she had been halfway through her education degree when she got pregnant, and Marcus had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with a child, and she had to drop out because working enough hours to survive left no time or energy for classes. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her across the small table, and then he asked why she did not continue her coursework online now that she had time and resources. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest and admitted that even online programs cost money she did not have, that her savings had been depleted by medical bills and rent, that her education felt like a dream from another lifetime. The next morning, Alexander's assistant appeared at her suite door with a sleek laptop, still in its box, and an information packet about an online degree completion program with a letter confirming that tuition had been paid in full for the next 2 years. Eleanor stood there staring at the items in shock, and then anger surged through her, hot and complicated, because this was too much, because she had not asked for this, because it made her feel like a charity case all over again. She found Alexander in his study and confronted him, her voice shaking as she demanded to know what he thought he was doing. Whether he planned to just fix every problem in her life without asking, whether he understood that she was not some project for him to manage. Alexander stood from his desk, his expression calm but his eyes intense, and he said the deal was that she takes care of herself, and that includes her future, that she has a brilliant mind being wasted because circumstances conspired against her, and he will not stand by and watch her give up on dreams when he has the means to help. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, but the words dissolved because she was deeply touched, despite her anger, because no one had ever believed in her potential like this, because he was looking at her like she mattered beyond just the baby she carried. The argument shifted into something else. The air between them suddenly charged, and Eleanor realized they were standing very close, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, and her breath caught as his gaze dropped to her mouth for just a fraction of a second. Then Alexander stepped back abruptly, his jaw tight, and muttered something about having calls to make before leaving the study without another word. Eleanor stood there alone, her heart racing and her hands trembling, and she understood with sudden terrifying clarity that her feelings for this man had become dangerously complicated. At her next appointment, Dr. Hastings performed the usual measurements and checks, while Eleanor lay on the examination table watching the doctor's face for any sign of concern. And when Dr. Hastings stepped back and made a note on her chart, Eleanor felt her stomach clench with anxiety even before the doctor spoke. Dr. Hastings smiled reassuringly and said that Eleanor's health had improved dramatically, that the anemia was resolving and her blood pressure was excellent, but she noted that the baby was measuring large, perhaps a pound or more above average for gestational age. And while this was not necessarily a problem, they would need to monitor closely as the due date approached. Eleanor nodded and tried to absorb the information, her mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios, and Dr. Hastings must have seen the fear in her eyes, because she squeezed Eleanor's hand and said they would watch carefully and make sure both mother and baby stayed safe. That evening, Eleanor sat across from Alexander at dinner and found herself pushing food around her plate instead of eating, her appetite stolen by the low hum of anxiety that had been building since the appointment. And finally, Alexander set down his fork and asked what was wrong. Eleanor told him about the baby measuring large, about the need for close monitoring, and she watched his face carefully as she spoke, saw the flash of fear that crossed his features before he controlled his expression back to careful neutrality, but his hand tightened around his water glass hard enough that his knuckles went white. He was silent for a long moment, and then asked in a voice that was almost too casual if she was frightened. Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest, and the truth spilled out before she could stop it, that she was terrified of labor, of going through it alone, of something going wrong, of not being strong enough, of failing her baby before she even had a chance to hold her. Her voice broke on the last words, and she looked down at her plate, ashamed of her weakness. But then she felt warmth cover her hand and looked up to find Alexander had reached across the table, his large hand engulfing hers in a grip that was both gentle and firm. The touch sent electricity through her body, a jolt of awareness that made her breath catch, and she realized this was the first time he had touched her beyond a polite handshake or steadying arm, the first time there was real connection in the contact. Alexander's dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed and seen, and he said in a voice rough with emotion that she would not be alone, that he would make sure she had the best care possible, that nothing would happen to her or the baby, and the fierce certainty in his tone made her believe him, even though she knew some things were beyond anyone's control. That night, Eleanor lay in her bed, unable to sleep, her hand resting on her belly where the baby shifted and rolled, and all she could think about was the warmth and strength of Alexander's hand on hers, the way his touch had made her feel safe, and something else she was afraid to name, and she finally admitted to herself in the darkness that she was falling for him, had been falling for weeks, and the realization terrified her almost as much as the approaching labor, because what if this was all just proximity and gratitude? What if he saw her only as a responsibility? What if she was building a future in her mind that could never exist? Meanwhile, down the hall, Alexander sat in his study, with only a single lamp burning, the photograph of Catherine in his hands, her smiling face frozen in a moment of joy that felt like it belonged to another lifetime, and he stared at the image of his dead wife and felt the crushing weight of guilt as he acknowledged what he had been trying to deny for days now, that his feelings for Eleanor had shifted into something he had no right to feel. That when he touched her hand tonight, every instinct screamed at him to pull her close and promise her everything. That he was falling in love with a woman who deserved so much better than a man haunted by the ghosts of his failures. He looked at Catherine's photograph and whispered that he was sorry, that he never meant for this to happen, that he did not know how to stop what he was feeling, and in the silence of the study, with only his guilt for company, Alexander understood that he could not stop it, that Eleanor had somehow slipped past every defense he had built, and he did not know whether that was salvation or just another way to fail someone he cared about. The intercom buzzer from the front gate shattered the quiet morning. 3 days after the conversation about the baby measuring large, and Eleanor was in the library attempting to focus on a reading assignment when she heard Alexander's footsteps moving quickly down the hallway, his pace urgent in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. She pushed herself up from the chair, her movements awkward with her belly, and made her way toward the foyer, where she found Alexander speaking in low tones with his head of security. And when he looked up and saw her, his expression shifted into something carefully neutral, which frightened her more than open concern would have. He dismissed the security guard with a curt nod and moved toward Eleanor, his hands coming up as if to steady her, though he stopped short of actually touching her, and he said that Marcus was at the gate demanding to see her. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, and her hand instinctively pressed against her stomach, where the baby gave a hard kick as if sensing her distress, and she heard herself ask why Marcus would come here, how he even knew where she was, her voice thin and unsteady. Alexander's jaw tightened, and he asked if she wanted to see him. The question clearly a formality, because his tone suggested he already knew the answer and was prepared to act on it. Eleanor shook her head and said no. But even as the word left her mouth, she knew Marcus well enough to understand he would not leave without causing a scene, without making his presence felt, because that was who he was, a man who could not stand being dismissed or ignored. Alexander's demeanor transformed before her eyes, the careful concern replaced by something cold and dangerous. Something that reminded Eleanor that this man had built an empire through ruthlessness as much as brilliance, and he told her to go upstairs and stay away from the windows while he handled this. Eleanor wanted to argue, but the authority in his voice stopped her, and instead she found herself moving to a second-floor window that overlooked the front gate, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Alexander stride down the long driveway with the confidence of a man walking onto his own battlefield. From her vantage point, she could not hear the words, but she could see Marcus gesturing wildly, his face red even from this distance, and Alexander standing perfectly still with his hands in his pockets, the picture of calm control, and the contrast was striking, made Marcus look small and desperate. The confrontation lasted no more than 5 minutes, brief but clearly intense, and Eleanor watched as Alexander leaned in close to Marcus and said something that made her ex step backward, his bluster visibly deflating, and whatever Alexander said next made Marcus go pale before he turned toward the gate. But Marcus could not leave without a final act of petty cruelty, because he turned back and shouted something, the words carrying up to where Eleanor stood, and she heard her name and the word money, and the phrase playing you, and the humiliation burned through her like acid because she knew exactly what Marcus had said, could fill in the gaps easily enough. She watched Alexander go very still and then gesture sharply toward the street, and Marcus finally left, but the damage was done because now Eleanor had to face Alexander, knowing what poison had been poured into his ears, and the terror that he might believe it, might see her differently now, made her legs weak. She heard the front door open and close, And then his footsteps on the stairs, swift and purposeful, and she was crying before he even entered the room, the tears hot on her cheeks as she tried to form words, tried to explain that she was not using him, that she never asked for any of this, that Marcus was a liar who wanted to hurt her. Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides, and his hands came up to frame her face, gentle despite the intensity in his dark eyes, and he told her to stop, to breathe, that he knew exactly who she was, and Marcus's poison changed nothing. Eleanor searched his face for doubt or suspicion, but found only fierce certainty and something deeper that made her breath catch, and his thumb brushed away her tears as he said that Marcus had no claim, no rights, no future contact with her, and that he had made sure Marcus understood the legal consequences of ever coming near her again. The intensity in his gaze made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear, and Eleanor realized that whatever existed between them had just shifted again, deepened by his protection and her vulnerability. And she understood that Alexander had not just defended her, but claimed her in a way that should have frightened her, but instead made her feel safer than she had ever felt in her life. The days following the confrontation with Marcus felt different in a way Eleanor could not quite articulate, as though the air in the mansion had changed its composition and now carried a charge that made her skin prickle with awareness whenever Alexander was near. He had always been attentive to her needs, but now his protectiveness intensified into something that felt almost like vigilance, and she would look up from her reading to find him watching her with an expression she could not decipher, or she would mention feeling tired, and he would immediately appear with pillows and insist she elevate her feet. And when she walked the garden paths, he began joining her, his presence silent but solid at her side. Eleanor noticed the way his eyes followed her when she moved through a room, tracking her with the focus of a man memorizing details, and she noticed the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, losing the crisp edge of command and becoming something warmer, something that made her pulse quicken. He started working from home more often, his office door open so he could hear if she called, and twice she caught him standing in the doorway of whatever room she occupied, just watching, and when she asked if he needed something, he would shake his head and retreat without explanation. One evening, they sat in the library together in what had become a comfortable ritual, Eleanor curled in the oversized chair with a textbook on her lap, while Alexander occupied the sofa with contract documents. And the silence between them felt easy and intimate, in a way that made Eleanor almost forget they were still essentially strangers, bound together by circumstance rather than choice. She was deep into a chapter about developmental psychology, when a sharp pain lanced through her belly, sudden and vicious enough to make her gasp and drop the book, her hand flying to her stomach. Alexander was beside her before the book hit the floor, his documents abandoned, his hands hovering near her shoulders as if afraid to touch, but desperate to help. And his face had gone pale as he demanded to know what was wrong, if he needed to call the doctor, if they should go to the hospital right now. Eleanor pressed her hand more firmly against her belly and felt it again, not pain exactly, but a powerful rolling movement. And she realized with a mixture of relief and wonder that the baby was kicking harder than she had ever felt before, performing what felt like acrobatics against the confines of her womb. Without thinking, operating purely on instinct and the desire to share this moment with someone who cared, Eleanor reached for Alexander's hand and guided it to the spot on her belly where she could feel the strongest movement, pressing his palm flat against the fabric of her shirt. Alexander froze the instant his hand made contact, his entire body going rigid, and Eleanor watched his face transform as he felt the baby move beneath his palm, felt the unmistakable press of a tiny foot or elbow pushing against his hand, and the expression that crossed his features was equal parts wonder and devastating pain. He whispered something she almost could not hear, his voice broken and raw, that he never got to feel his daughter move, that Catherine had kept so much from him trying to protect him from worry, putting on a brave face even as her body failed her, and by the time he knew something was truly wrong, it was too late to save either of them. Eleanor felt her heart crack at the grief in his voice, and she covered his hand with hers, pressing both their palms against her belly, keeping him connected to this moment, to this life. And she told him she was sorry for what he had lost, but she was glad he could experience this now, that he did not have to miss it again. They stayed like that for a long moment, his hand warm and large against her stomach, her smaller hand covering his, the baby moving between them as if acknowledging the connection. And Eleanor felt something shift between them, deepen into territory that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. Then Alexander pulled his hand away, as if the contact burned him, stood abruptly, and left the room without looking back, his footsteps echoing down the hallway with barely controlled urgency. Eleanor sat alone in the library with her hand still pressed to her belly, and understood that Alexander was battling demons she could not fight for him, wrestling with guilt and grief and something else she had seen clearly in his eyes before he fled, something that looked achingly like longing. Eleanor was now in her 9th month, her belly enormous and tight, and the tension in the mansion had become something she could almost taste, thick and electric like the air before a thunderstorm. And she noticed that Alexander had become intensely focused on her well-being in a way that bordered on obsessive, checking on her multiple times throughout the day, appearing in doorways as if to verify her continued existence. His questions about how she felt delivered with an urgency that spoke to deeper fears he would not name. Dr. Hastings arrived for a home check on a gray Thursday afternoon, examining Eleanor in the comfort of her suite, rather than making her travel to the office, and after a thorough examination, the doctor noted with professional cheerfulness that Eleanor was dilated to 2 centimeters already, that the baby was in perfect position, and that labor could begin any day now, perhaps even any hour, and Eleanor should be prepared to move quickly when contractions started. That evening, Eleanor felt restless despite her exhaustion, unable to settle into reading or watching television, and she found herself wandering the hallways of the mansion until she stood outside Alexander's study, where a sliver of light escaped beneath the door, and when she knocked softly, the light shifted as if something had moved inside, and his voice, when he called for her to enter, sounded strained and distant. She pushed open the door to find him standing beside his desk with his back to her, his shoulders rigid, and even before he turned, she saw the photograph in his hand, saw the way he held it carefully as though it might shatter. And when he realized she was there, he moved quickly to return it to the drawer, but Eleanor had already seen enough to know this was the photograph she had glimpsed once before. The image of the woman who haunted this house as surely as if she still walked its halls. Eleanor moved further into the room, her movements slow and awkward with her massive belly, and she asked him quietly to tell her about Catherine, speaking the name she had learned from Dr. Hastings weeks ago but had never said aloud in Alexander's presence. He stood frozen for a long moment, his hand still on the drawer handle, and Eleanor thought he might refuse, might retreat behind the walls he had built so carefully. But then his shoulders dropped, and he pulled the photograph back out, looking down at it with an expression of such profound loss that Eleanor felt tears prick her own eyes. He spoke slowly at first, describing a vibrant woman with dark hair and a laugh that filled rooms, stubborn and brilliant, and refusing to be treated as fragile even when she should have been, even when her body was failing in ways she hid from everyone, including him. And his voice gained strength as he told Eleanor about Catherine's preeclampsia, how she had downplayed the headaches and swelling and vision problems because he was overseas negotiating the deal that would secure his company's future, and she did not want to worry him, did not want to be the reason he lost focus or came home early. Alexander's voice broke as he explained that by the time he returned and realized how sick Catherine truly was, it was too late, that her blood pressure was dangerously high and her kidneys were failing, that they performed an emergency cesarean, trying to save both lives, but lost them anyway. His wife and his daughter gone within hours of each other, while he stood helpless in a hospital corridor. He admitted that he had never forgiven himself for not being there, for not seeing the signs before he left, for prioritizing business over the woman he loved, and he said that every day for 5 years he had lived with the knowledge that he had failed them both in the moment they needed him most. Eleanor felt her heart break for this man who carried such impossible guilt, and she moved to him despite the awkwardness of her body, her belly bumping against him as she wrapped her arms around his rigid frame, and she told him with quiet certainty that it was not his fault, that Catherine had made her own choices, that he could not have known, that carrying this guilt forever would not bring them back and would not honor their memory. Alexander resisted for a moment, and then his arms came around her fiercely, his face burying in her hair, and Eleanor felt him tremble against her as he finally allowed himself to grieve in front of another person, his breath hot and uneven against her neck, and she held him as tightly as her awkward position allowed and felt the baby kick between them, as if reminding them both that life continued, that hope persisted, that healing was possible even after devastating loss. Eleanor woke in darkness to a sensation that felt at first like the continuation of a dream, a strange liquid warmth spreading beneath her in the bed, and for a confused moment, she thought she had somehow wet herself before her sleep-fogged brain caught up and she realized with a jolt of pure terror that her water had just broken, and she called out for Alexander with a voice that cracked with fear, his name echoing through the silent mansion. He appeared in her doorway within seconds, as if he had been waiting just outside, already dressed despite the hour being past 2 in the morning, and Eleanor understood in that moment that he had not been sleeping either, that he had been keeping vigil for exactly this occurrence. And when he saw her sitting up in the wet bed with her hands trembling on her enormous belly, his face went carefully blank in the way she had learned meant he was controlling intense emotion. He moved with swift efficiency that masked whatever fear he felt, helping her out of bed, gathering the bag she had packed weeks ago under Dr. Hastings' instruction, calling the doctor while simultaneously guiding Eleanor toward the stairs, and his voice on the phone was steady and calm, even as his free hand gripped Eleanor's arm with barely restrained force. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of streetlights and early contractions that made Eleanor gasp and grip the door handle, and she saw Alexander's knuckles go white on the steering wheel each time she made a sound of pain. But he kept his voice low and soothing, telling her she was doing well, that they would be there soon, that everything would be fine, even though she could see the barely controlled fear in the tight line of his jaw. At the hospital, they were whisked into a labor and delivery room where nurses moved around her with practiced efficiency, hooking her up to monitors and checking her dilation, and when a young nurse with kind eyes asked who Alexander was and whether he would be staying, Eleanor felt a contraction hit hard enough to steal her breath, and through the pain she grabbed his hand and said, "He is the father," the words tumbling out without conscious thought, born of panic and need and the desperate desire not to be alone in this terrifying experience. Alexander met her eyes as the contraction peaked and squeezed her hand hard enough that she felt his strength flow into her, and he did not correct her, did not explain their complicated arrangement, simply nodded to the nurse and stayed exactly where he was at Eleanor's side. The hours that followed blurred into an endless cycle of pain and pressure and exhaustion, her body doing things she could not control, and through it all Alexander remained, letting her grip his hand until she knew she must be leaving bruises, whispering encouragement when she sobbed that she could not do this, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, and becoming the anchor she desperately needed in a storm of sensation that threatened to drown her. When Dr. Hastings arrived and examined her with a concerned frown, mentioning that labor was not progressing as quickly as expected and they might need to consider a cesarean section, Eleanor saw Alexander go absolutely pale, saw his trauma resurface in the way his hand started trembling in hers and his breathing became shallow, and she knew he was no longer in this room, but in another hospital 5 years ago, watching the woman he loved slip away. Eleanor pulled him close despite her exhaustion, forced him to look at her face, instead of whatever horror memory was showing him, and told him with as much strength as she could summon that she was going to be fine, that he needed to stay with her right now, that she needed him here and present and not lost in the past. Alexander blinked and focused on her, visibly fighting his demons, and nodded once before taking a shaky breath and becoming solid again. And Eleanor felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly eclipsed the physical pain. Dr. Hastings decided to give her another hour before making the call on surgery, and somewhere in that final stretch, Eleanor found reserves she did not know she possessed, her body bearing down with primal force. And finally, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, she felt the baby slip free and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a thin, furious cry that announced her daughter's arrival into life. Eleanor sobbed with relief and exhaustion and overwhelming joy as the doctor placed the tiny vernix-covered baby on her chest. And when she looked up at Alexander through tears, she saw that he had closed his eyes and tears were streaming down his face unchecked, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and she knew he was crying for his lost daughter and for this new life, and for the miracle of being present for a birth, instead of arriving too late to say goodbye. In the recovery room, Eleanor held her daughter Grace against her chest and felt an overwhelming surge of love, so powerful it bordered on terror, the tiny weight of the baby solid and real, and completely dependent on her. And she marveled at the perfection of miniature fingers, and the rosebud mouth, and the way Grace's eyes seemed to look at her with ancient wisdom, despite being only minutes old. Alexander sat beside the hospital bed in a chair he had pulled as close as possible, his body angled toward them, and Eleanor noticed he had not looked away from the baby since the nurses had cleaned and swaddled her, his expression a complicated mixture of wonder and grief and something else she could not quite name. Eleanor asked softly if he wanted to hold her, her voice rough from hours of screaming through contractions, and Alexander hesitated in a way that made her heart ache because she saw fear flicker across his features before he nodded and reached out with careful hands. She transferred Grace into his arms, showing him how to support the head, and watched his face transform as he cradled the tiny bundle against his chest, his large hands looking impossibly gentle as they curved around the baby's small body. He looked at Grace with such tenderness and pain that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes again, though she thought she had cried herself dry during labor, and he whispered that Grace was perfect, that Eleanor had been amazing, that he had never seen anything as brave as what she had just done. When he looked up from the baby to meet Eleanor's gaze, there was something raw and unguarded in his expression, a vulnerability she had only glimpsed once before when he told her about Catherine, and he said that during the labor when she had called him the father, his first feeling had not been panic or the urge to correct the assumption, but rather a sense of rightness, as if she had named a truth he had been too afraid to speak. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest, and she felt her heart begin to race despite her exhaustion, and Alexander continued speaking in a low voice, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep inside him, saying that somewhere along the way he had stopped thinking of her as someone he was helping and started thinking of her as his, that she belonged in his home and in his life, in a way that had nothing to do with charity or guilt. He admitted that he knew the timing was terrible, that she had just endured hours of labor and was exhausted and vulnerable, that she owed him nothing and had agreed to no more than the arrangement they had formalized months ago, but he needed her to know that he had fallen in love with her and wanted to be there for her and Grace, not as a benefactor or a friend, but as a partner, as a husband if she would have him. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she processed his words. Exhaustion and hormones and overwhelming emotion combining into something that felt too large for her body to contain. And she told him through her tears that she loved him too, that she had loved him for weeks now, that every evening at dinner and every moment of his unexpected kindness had wound itself around her heart until she could not imagine a life without him in it. But even as she said it, she felt a flicker of fear and asked him in a whisper if he was certain this was about her and not about Catherine, if he was trying to save her because he could not save his wife, if this was redemption rather than love. Alexander carefully set Grace in the clear plastic bassinet beside the bed, where she made small snuffling sounds, and curled her tiny fists near her face. And then he took Eleanor's hand in both of his and held it gently, looking into her eyes with an intensity that made her feel exposed and seen in equal measure. He promised that this was not about Catherine or his lost daughter, that his grief and guilt had brought Eleanor into his life. But what he felt now had nothing to do with the past, and everything to do with who Eleanor was, with her strength and dignity, and the way she had brought warmth back into his frozen existence. And he wanted to build a future with her, not to repair what he had lost, but to create something entirely new. Eleanor and Grace moved back to the estate after 3 days in the hospital, and the moment they crossed the threshold, Eleanor felt that everything had shifted in some fundamental way, as if the mansion itself had transformed from a place of temporary refuge into something that felt dangerously close to home. Alexander carried Grace in her infant car seat, with the exaggerated care of someone terrified of breaking something precious, and Eleanor followed slowly, her body still sore and healing from the trauma of birth, every step a reminder of what she had endured and survived. He led her not to her original suite, but to a different wing of the house she had never explored. And when he opened a door, Eleanor stopped in the doorway and felt tears spring immediately to her eyes because he had created a nursery so perfect it took her breath away. The walls were painted a soft sage green that reminded her of new growth in spring, and a white crib stood against one wall dressed in linen so fine Eleanor was afraid to touch them, and there was a rocking chair positioned near the window where light streamed in golden and warm, and shelves already held books and soft toys, and all the small necessities a baby could need. Alexander set the car seat down gently and turned to Eleanor with an expression that was almost shy, asking if she liked it, if it was too much, and Eleanor could only nod because her throat had closed with emotion at the realization that he must have been planning this for weeks, ordering items and arranging the room while she slept unaware down the hall. Over the following weeks, as Eleanor's body slowly healed and she adjusted to the overwhelming reality of caring for a newborn, Alexander was constantly present in a way that both comforted and surprised her. He appeared for the 2 a.m. feedings when Grace woke screaming with hunger, standing in the nursery doorway until Eleanor waved him in, and he learned to change diapers with the same focused intensity he probably applied to business negotiations, watching tutorial videos on his phone and practicing the technique until he could fasten the tabs with competent efficiency. Eleanor watched him rock Grace to sleep with her tiny head cradled in his large hand, and felt her heart expand with a love that frightened her in its intensity, because this was no longer about gratitude or circumstance, but something far more dangerous and permanent. One evening when Grace was nearly 4 weeks old, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair feeding the baby while Alexander stood at the window watching them with an expression she could not decipher, and when Grace finally fell asleep milk-drunk and peaceful, Eleanor looked up to find him staring at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He crossed the room and knelt beside the rocking chair so they were eye level, his hand coming up to gently touch Grace's downy head, and he asked Eleanor if she would marry him, the question so quiet she almost thought she had imagined it. But then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring that was simple and elegant, a single diamond set in platinum with small sapphires flanking it, and he told her that he wanted to adopt Grace, to give both of them his name, to build a real family instead of this arrangement that had started as charity and become something neither of them had planned. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at him kneeling there with hope and fear written clearly across his features, and she realized that this was not a fairy tale rescue where the prince saved the damsel, but something far more real and complicated and precious. A partnership between two broken people who had somehow found a way to make each other whole. She said yes, her voice barely a whisper, and watched his face transform with relief and joy. And when he leaned forward to kiss her, it was soft and careful and full of promise, their first real kiss as two people choosing each other deliberately rather than being thrown together by circumstance. Grace stirred between them, making small sounds of sleepy protest at the movement, and they both laughed quietly, and Alexander took the baby from Eleanor's arms and held her against his chest while Eleanor stood on shaking legs, and together they placed Grace in her crib and stood watching her sleep, their hands intertwined, the ring heavy and real on Eleanor's finger, a symbol of the future they were choosing to build together. They married quietly. 6 weeks later, on a morning in early autumn, when the estate gardens were still lush with late-blooming roses, and the air held that particular quality of light that made everything seem softer and more forgiving, and Eleanor stood in her bedroom, holding Grace against her shoulder, while Alexander's assistant helped adjust the simple ivory dress they had chosen together. A dress that skimmed her post-pregnancy body with elegant forgiveness and made her feel beautiful in a way she had never experienced before. The ceremony took place on the south lawn near the fountain where Eleanor had walked so many times during her pregnancy, and the only witnesses were Dr. Hastings, who had become something like a friend through all the medical appointments and crisis moments, and James, Alexander's assistant, who Eleanor had learned was fiercely loyal and had worked for Alexander since before Catherine's death. Alexander stood waiting for her in a dark suit that made his eyes look almost black, and when Eleanor walked toward him across the grass, with Grace sleeping in her arms, she saw his expression transform into something so tender it made her chest ache, and she realized that this moment was nothing like the wedding she had once imagined as a young girl, but was somehow more real and precious because of everything they had survived to reach it. The officiant was brief and professional, understanding without being told that neither of them wanted elaborate ceremony or flowery language. And when the time came for vows, Alexander took Eleanor's free hand and spoke in a voice that was quiet but absolutely steady, promising to protect her, to honor her strength, to be the father Grace deserved, and to love Eleanor for the rest of his life with the same intensity and commitment he brought to everything he did. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she made her own promises, vowing to trust him, to build a future together rather than simply surviving day to day, and to help him heal as he had helped her find safety and love when she had believed both were impossible. When the officiant pronounced them married, and Alexander kissed her gently while Grace stirred between them, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones that she had never experienced before, as if all the broken pieces of her life had finally arranged themselves into a pattern that made sense. After the ceremony, they went inside for a simple lunch, and then Alexander told Eleanor there was one more thing he needed to show her, something he had been waiting for the right moment to share, and he led her to his study while James took Grace to give them privacy. Alexander opened the drawer Eleanor knew contained Catherine's photograph, the image he had kept locked away like a secret or a wound, and he removed the silver frame and held it carefully as he explained that he would always carry love and grief for Catherine, that she had been part of his life and shaped who he became, but he had finally forgiven himself for failing to save her and their daughter, and he knew with absolute certainty that Catherine would want him to be happy, would want him to build a new life rather than remaining frozen in guilt and loss. He placed the photograph on the shelf among other family pictures where it could be seen and acknowledged rather than hidden, no longer a shrine or a source of shame, but simply a memory of someone he had loved. And when he turned to Eleanor, his eyes were clear in a way she had never seen before. He told her that she had brought him back to life when he had been merely existing, that Grace had brought light and noise and joy back into a house that had been silent too long, and that he was finally ready to stop living in the past and start building a future with intention and hope. Eleanor embraced him tightly, feeling Grace shift in James's arms somewhere in another room, and they stood together as a family newly formed, the weight of the past acknowledged but no longer crushing, the future spreading before them like the gardens beyond the window, full of potential and growth, and the promise of seasons yet to come. 6 months had passed since the quiet garden wedding, and Eleanor stood in the estate library looking out at the grounds where snow had just begun to fall in lazy spirals, and she found herself thinking about time and transformation and how a life could pivot on a single moment of desperation or grace. She had completed her first semester of online coursework with grades that surprised even her, staying up late after Grace's feedings to write papers and complete assignments, while Alexander worked in his study nearby, the two of them existing in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional sound of Grace stirring through the baby monitor. The estate that had once felt like a museum, cold and perfect and untouchable, now bore the cheerful chaos of actual life with colorful toys scattered across the Persian rugs and baby swings set up in rooms that had previously held only expensive art. And Eleanor loved the transformation, loved how Alexander no longer flinched when Grace's sticky hands touched his tailored suits, or when her toys disrupted the previously pristine order of his world. Grace herself had grown into a happy, healthy baby with Alexander's dark eyes and Eleanor's smile, and Eleanor watched daily as her daughter wrapped Alexander more completely around her tiny fingers, demanding his attention with imperious cries that had him abandoning conference calls and rearranging meetings without hesitation. That afternoon, Alexander had asked Eleanor to meet him in his study after Grace went down for her nap, his tone holding something she could not quite identify, and when she entered she found him standing by his desk holding a folder, with an expression that made her heart skip because she had learned to read his faces, and this one held barely contained emotion. He handed her the folder without preamble, and Eleanor opened it with shaking hands to discover adoption papers, finalized and legal, declaring Alexander Thornhill as Grace's father in the eyes of the law, with all rights and responsibilities that entailed. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she looked up at him and saw answering moisture in his eyes, and he pulled her close and told her that Grace was his daughter in every way that mattered, that he would protect her and provide for her and love her for his entire life, and that someday when Grace was old enough to understand, they would tell her the whole story of how her mother had been so brave and strong, scrubbing floors while 8 months pregnant to build a future for a baby she had not even met yet. That night after they put Grace to bed together, going through the ritual of bath and bottle and stories that had become sacred routine, Alexander and Eleanor retreated to their bedroom, and their relationship that had begun in desperation and evolved through crisis had finally settled into something that felt like permanence, like safety, like the kind of love that could weather storms because it had been forged in them. Eleanor lay in Alexander's arms, listening to his steady heartbeat, and thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, exhausted and terrified and alone, and felt profound gratitude, not just for the material security he had provided, but for the way he had seen her, really seen her, and chosen to build something real rather than simply offering charity. Alexander's hand traced slow patterns on her shoulder as he told her he had been thinking about expanding the East Wing to add more rooms because he hoped Grace would not be an only child forever, and Eleanor laughed softly and turned to kiss him. And in that moment she understood that fairy tales were not about princes rescuing helpless maidens, but about two broken people choosing